저희 구독자분들께 인사 부탁드려요.
안녕하세요. 저는 프랑스에서 온 한국 공부대사 클라라입니다.
자, 인터뷰는 영어로 하겠습니다. Okay, let's move on to the interview. Clara, what is your major?
I have a master's in economics. So
Oh.
my major is economics, international economics actually.
Oh, really? As an economic major, then what are you interested in Korea?
Many things, but I think when we talk about Korea economics, it's kind of, we don't really learn about it at school, in the university. We just know that Korea is a developed country, but we don't really, it's just like, it's a developed country, but we don't really learn about the roots or the reasons why.
Yeah.
So I think the most interesting thing is that when I went to Korea, I could learn about Korean economics and why it became such a developed country so fast, actually.
Then, Clara, why do you think Korean economics is important?
I think it's very important, and also it's very important to study why
That's
it
really
grew up
good.
so
Yeah.
fast, and not just Korean economics now, but the past also. Because Korea was in the 1960s, one of the poorest countries in the world, and it's now in 2022 one of the most developed in the world. So in the span of a very short amount of time, it became very developed and very powerful and very rich. So I think if we start to look at the roots and why Korea developed so fast, we can take this example and try to mimic it into other developing countries, right? If we take Korean example and we try maybe to mimic it to other countries, it could serve like as an example. I think we could use it.
That's why you made a video about the Korean economic growth, right?
Exactly.
Oh, could you tell me about that more?
So what I wanted to do is to showcase how Korea economics was not a miracle, because when we learn about it at university, it's kind of like, now Korea is a developed country. It's like it's a miracle. I mean, how can it happen? Like, Koreans didn't wake up one day and were like, we are a developed country now. I mean, it took maybe a short amount of time, but it's deeply rooted into history and culture of Korea.
It's really impressive that you mentioned that it's not a miracle and it's kind of a potential of resources of 5,000 years Korean history, right?
Exactly.
Oh, can you tell me more about that?
So I wanted to showcase how Korea long history and culture could influence over time Korea growth, and how Korea society and Korean people mind and assets were already prepared for such a rapid growth because of its history and culture. So I did many research to find about it, and I wrote an article and I made a video about it to showcase this.
Oh, then what do you think is the main factor in Korean economic growth?
So there are many factors actually. I didn't study like deeply about it, so I wouldn't be able to tell everything.
Yeah.
It would take too
We
much
cannot
time.
mention them all.
Oh, for sure. But what I found is that Korea is a knowledge economy.
Oh, knowledge economy. Why?
Which means that Korea relies on 4 different pillars, which are education, innovation, communication infrastructures, and economic incentive. So how it works is that you have a country can achieve being a knowledge economy, for example, if the 4 different pillars are as developed. So you need to have like a very strong education infrastructure, so maybe university or high schools with like good programs, for example. And this, if you have like a very educated people, you can have strong innovation, right? Because people would study about science or something like this, and they could innovate a lot. And this innovation can make Korea being a very important country, so they could trade, for example. And also, in order to trade or in order to have a very connected society, you need to have very strong communication infrastructures. And also, you need a country that supports the economy, because you need all of these reforms, like they cost a lot of money, like to invest in universities or to invest in high school. So you need a country that supports the economy. Actually, I mean, the degree on which they should support the economy depends on government and etc. But in general, they should support the economy.
That's why you mentioned it's not a miracle.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can you tell me about more specific examples about why you think Korean economic growth is not a miracle?
Right. So what I wanted to do is to showcase some examples on why Korean economy grew so fast.
Yeah.
Because it actually grew so fast. In history, it's very unique, right? But I wanted to show how this uniqueness doesn't rely on a miracle, but relies on history mainly. So what I found very impressive also is that history of Korea relies on a lot of innovations.
Oh, innovations. What kind of innovations?
For example, the jikji
Oh,
is a
you know
great
jikji?
example.
Oh.
It's a great example because it's actually in France now.
That's
So
why you're
that's why
interested in-
I'm very interested in this. And I think jikji is a great example of how Korea was a leader of innovation, even not now, like even in the past.
Yeah. Could you tell me why jikji is so innovative?
So jikji is actually the first book ever printed in movable metal type. I think it's very innovative because first it's the first, of course, and also it's led Occident after to do the same. So at school, if we learn in high school or in middle school in France, we learn that Gutenberg Bible was the first book ever printed, which is completely wrong. And it's very Eurocentric to me, because I was very upset that we learned something wrong, actually. And now jikji is preserved in the National Library in France, and France doesn't want to give jikji back to Korea. I don't really understand why, actually, but I think it created a spirit of innovation that is movable metal type printing was changed the world because it could access everyone to be able to read books, something like this. So I think it's a great invention.
Yeah, that kind of resources make Korean economic growth.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can you tell me more about Korean economic growth factors?
Also, what is very impressive is Korea communication system.
Oh.
So Korea has one of the fastest internet speed or internet coverage, which is very impressive, right? But I wanted to ask about why is it the case?
Oh, this is also not a miracle.
I really, actually, it took me a long time to understand it because it was kind of hidden information.
Oh.
Because if you look at it in the internet, it's just like, oh yeah, Korea is a very connected country. Okay.
That's all.
Oh, but what I found very interesting is that Korea was equipped by Bongsu system.
You know Bongsu?
Oh, it's very interesting because I didn't know about it, but I saw it before. If you go on a train, like a hiking trip, something like this, or on Seoul, you can actually see Bongsu. And I was like, oh, okay, it's just a beacon tower. I didn't really realize what it was. But when I read about Bongsu and what it was doing, I found it, but it's totally linked to today Korea communication system. So Bongsu was a way for people to communicate and to show when there was a threat coming in the country, from the sea or from the north, for example. And it was very fast, actually, for the time. And it was still used during the Joseon dynasty, which is kind of very impressive. And so I think this kind of system, who was very innovative for the time, created a mindset for Koreans to have high communication system, to communicate.
That's really impressive. I'm also impressive that you know Bongsu.
Yeah.
Then let's find out other factors. You already mentioned about educations, innovations, and communications, and the last one.
It's economic incentive.
Can you tell me more about that?
I think economic incentive is, of course, it's a very new way of government to be implied in the economy, right? But I think you can relate it to the way Koreans nobles and Korean warriors and kings, for example, were always involved for the welfare of population. So, for example, the creation of Hangul is a great example of it, how King Sejong created this for the people. It's a good example. Or how after the Korean liberation and the creation of the Korean constitution, education was a big part of the constitution, and how it should be mandatory to be educated. Korean government always wanted to be involved into the Korean economics because they wanted the good for the people. I think.
So impressive. Could you summarize all the contents that you already mentioned in one or two sentences?
During my research, I found that Korea economics is very unique. And very interesting, but very tricky to understand because it has a lot of roots. So it relies on culture and history that leads Korea to be a knowledge economy based on innovation, education, communication, and economic incentive, I think.
Clara, I think this is the last question. What do you want to say to the people who don't know about Korean history or Korean economic growth?
So it's very fun to know about Korean history and Korean economic growth because it's full of surprises. It's so long that you can...
Yeah, 5,000 years.
You have to find something that's interesting for you, for sure. If it's monuments or artifacts or war or like it's so interesting, right? So I think everyone could be interested in it. So maybe many people who know Korean culture through K-pop or K-food or K-drama, they can, if they come to Korea or even if they're interested, they could check contents so they could learn more about it for sure.
Thank you. I think we should say goodbye. Please say goodbye to our audience. Or anything to add?
I think, I mean, if anything to add is that I learned a lot while doing the video because as an economics major, it's always interesting to learn about the growth of other countries and the factors. And I was very surprised that I didn't know about Korean economic growth before. So I'm happy I did. I know about it now, and I'm sure when I'm going to go back to France, I will be able to learn to talk about it. So it's very interesting. Yeah.
Say goodbye to our audience.
Goodbye.